So we've had 10 men of virtue so far. Well, 11 really, but I wasn't happy with one, so I deleted it. I thought it would be helpful to collect them all in one place for posterity, and then at the end go a bit more into what we've learned so far. You'll probably notice the steadily improving quality from the first to the last video. I certainly did. The first video was very early on in the channel's history and I was still finding my footing. Well, in truth, I still am. I hope you can bear with me as I continue to try and improve the quality of what I offer. If you've already seen all of the shorts, the new content starts at the time displayed on the screen. So without further ado, Cincinnatus was a Roman during the age of the Republic and held position as a consul for a period. He then left the city of Rome and retired to a farm he owned west of the Tiber. He was later appointed for a 6-month term as dictator, a king-like position appointed by the Senate in times of emergency, in order to defeat the army invading Rome's lands. He raised his own army and encircled the invading force before listening to their pleas for mercy and merely executing their commanders. Cincinnatus then disbanded his army and returned to his farm, giving control back to the Senate only 15 days after it was granted to him. Nearly 20 years later, he was called upon again to be dictator. He did his duty to protect the Republic and then returned power, this time after only 21 days. The virtue I see in Cincinnatus' tale is that of being able to accept responsibility when you are called upon, and being capable of wielding the power necessary to complete your task, whether that be great or slight, and then being able to relinquish that power the moment it is no longer required. Vitalis left his monastery when he was 60 and travelled to Alexandria. Once there, he wrote down the name and address of every lady of the night in the city and began praying for them. He hired himself out as a day labourer and would spend the day working, and then each night would visit a different woman, telling them, "I beg you, take this money and do not sin with anyone tonight." He would then spend the night praying for them while they slept. He made them promise not to tell anyone the purpose of his visits, and so was reviled by the people of the town, and was eventually killed by a man who misunderstood his visits. Upon his death, the women he visited revealed the truth. Many of those he visited left the profession. I'm not going to get into the morality of prostitution in this video. That's definitely a larger discussion. The point is that Vitalis thought it was wrong, and so wanted to help these women out of their quote-unquote sin. The virtue I see in this story is doing things you believe are virtuous, not for external validation, but because you believe they are right, and being able to handle the derision of others in your pursuit of this. Baldwin was a Crusader king of Jerusalem. He acquired leprosy at a young age, which worsened throughout the rest of his life, debilitating him. Despite this, he defended the kingdom for his whole life, battling against the Islamic Caliphate led by Salah ad-Din, defeating him in battle multiple times, often with much weaker armies. Unable to marry due to his leprosy, he wished to abdicate his throne, yet felt unable to do so as there were no suitable candidates. This forced him to continue to rule, and even when the leprosy took his vision and his ability to walk, he still went to war in a litter slung between 2 horses, as his presence was essential to unite the factions in his kingdom. No territory was lost during Baldwin's reign, and he died just 24 years old. The virtues I see in his story are of the mental fortitude and willpower it must have taken him to continue to rule for the good of his people, despite his terrible illness, and the incredible bravery to fight against invaders in person, disabled as he was. Winston Churchill led Britain to victory against the Nazis during World War II. Prior to this, he had held both combat and political positions during the First World War. In 1916, he called for the greater application of mechanical power to the prosecution of offence on land. This was largely ignored at the time, but he was proven correct by the eventual abundance of tanks in future wars. He was vehemently opposed to the appeasement policy the rest of his party and much of the country had towards the Nazis in the 30s, saying an appeaser is one who feeds a crocodile, hoping it will eat him last. He then led Britain as they stood alone against the Nazis, from the fall of France in June 1940, until Hitler invaded the Soviets in 1941. The virtue I see in his tale is, to steal a phrase, even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it's your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, "No, you move." Churchill didn't move. He was undoubtedly the greatest man these isles ever created. Moses the Ethiopian was a slave in Egypt before he was dismissed for theft and suspected murder. He then roamed in a band of robbers until one day, while fleeing from the authorities, he hid in a monastery. The dedication of their lives, their peace and contentment, influenced him deeply. He abandoned his life of crime and converted to Christianity, joining the monastery. On one occasion, a monk committed a fault, and Moses was invited to discuss his penance. He walked to the meeting point, carrying a leaking jug of water, and said, "My sins run out behind me, and I do not see them, but today I am coming to judge the errors of another." Upon hearing this, the assembled brothers forgave the erring monk. When he was 75, a group of robbers attacked the monastery. He sent the monks away and himself remained, saying, "All those who take up the sword will perish by the sword." He was martyred by the bandits. The virtue I see in his tale is that of being careful of your judgment of others. As the saying goes, people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, and of being willing to die for your ideals. Marcus Aurelius was a Roman emperor and part-time Stoic philosopher. He was the last of the rulers later known as the Five Good Emperors, and with his death came the end of the Pax Romana. He defended Rome from invasions by the Germanic tribes and financed these wars by selling off imperial assets rather than imposing high taxes. He avoided the stain of purple, that of succumbing to power, and ruled his empire in the interest of its citizens, promoting religious tolerance towards groups like the Christians, improving the treatment of slaves, and providing greater protections for minors and orphans. He was the model philosopher king, and his book Meditations is still read widely by statesmen today. The virtue I take from Aurelius is that of proving that power doesn't necessarily have to corrupt a person. He achieved this through sticking to moral principles that he chose for himself. He did this through Stoicism, but I would urge you to figure out what you believe is moral and not, and try to live by that. You will fall short many times, as we all do as humans, but I suspect that the total amount of good you will do will be more than if you didn't try to live by any principles at all. I'll be releasing a video on some Stoic teachings I'm fond of in the next few days. George Washington was the first president of the United States of America and was in charge of their armies against the British, but I don't hold that against him. Before he was commander of the Continental Armies, he spent time working as a surveyor, a farmer, and a soldier. At the outset of the Revolutionary War, he was elected by Congress to lead the fight against the British. He eventually won a decisive victory at Yorktown, which effectively ended the war. Once the British were defeated, he surrendered the army, passing his first test on avoiding becoming a tyrant. He was involved in the creation of the Constitution and then was unanimously elected as president, which he served for 2 terms before leaving office. His story has echoes of Cincinnatus, a man who lived 2 millennia before him and who I have a video on if you're interested. The virtue I take from George Washington above all is his temperance. He could have easily secured dictator for life position as commander of the armies and then again as president, but he chose not to for the good of the nation. Which man was the major inspiration to the father of America, George Washington, as well as many of the other revolutionaries? Cato the Younger, the patriot prepared to give his life for the cause of liberty, and in fact he did give his life to this end. Cato was an influential Roman senator during the late Republic. He was a follower of Stoicism and was famous for his honesty and incorruptibility in running Rome's finances, to the extent that the phrase "we can't all be Catos" was coined about him. He wouldn't take bribes and refused to compromise on his principles, in a culture where bribery and political favours were very common, and no, I don't mean modern-day DC. He is most famous for being Julius Caesar's most formidable enemy. He opposed Caesar's legislative programme during his first consulship and allied with Pompey against Caesar during the Civil War. After his cause was defeated, he took his own life rather than submitting to Caesar. The virtue I take from Cato is that even when living in a den of corruption surrounded by vice, you can rise above it. You are not compelled to lower yourself to the level of your surroundings, you can be more. Who was the real-life inspiration behind Jack Black's character Nacho Libre? Fray Tormenta was a Mexican Catholic priest who fought as a lucha libre wrestler in order to fund an orphanage he founded for 23 years. Sergio Benitez was born the 17th of 18 kids. By age 22, he was addicted to drugs and alcohol and living a life of vice when he felt called upon to join the priesthood. His training took him to Rome and Spain, and he then taught at universities in Mexico for a time before becoming a secular priest for the Diocese of Texcoco. It was during this time he founded an orphanage that homed 270 children. Lacking money to support these children, he became the masked wrestler Fray Tormenta to fund the orphanage. He has since retired from wrestling, now being 79 years old, but his mantle has been taken up by one of his children who wrestles as Fray Tormenta Jr. He continues to work at the orphanage as its priest. The virtues I take from his story are abundant: charity, humility, to create a fulfilling life from humble beginnings. It would be hard to pick just one to focus on, so I won't. I'll let you do that. Let me know what virtue you take from his story, and if you have anyone who you think deserves a Men of Virtue chapter made about them, let me know in the comments. The virtue I take from Elon is putting humanity above himself. You might think me naive for this, but he could have easily retired after PayPal was sold and lived a peaceful life off his savings. Instead, he threw all of his wealth into trying to make humanity multiplanetary and making electric cars mainstream, both of which nearly went bankrupt. He then went on to found the Boring Company, ostensibly with the goal of reducing traffic by tunnelling under cities, but which I believe he did with the intention of improving tunnelling technology in preparation for Mars. Then Neuralink, which he founded with the goal of bringing humanity closer to the level of the fast-approaching AGIs. He has now bought Twitter to protect freedom of speech after seeing the suppression over the pandemic by social media companies. You may disagree with his political opinions, you have every right to do so, but I believe that what he does because he's trying to expand humanity throughout the stars and protect it from cataclysms he perceives to be ahead of us. I don't think he's the Messiah, and I disagree with some of his actions, but I think he's an overall positive for humanity. I'm happy to discuss this further in the comments should you wish. That's the first 10 Men of Virtues. I warned you that the early ones weren't great quality, and I wasn't lying. So what themes can we take? There are obvious parallels between Cincinnatus and Washington, both men being given vast power on numerous occasions and wielding it effectively and for the good of the populace rather than themselves, and both men willing to give it up. Washington was also known to admire Cato, and you can see how this might have affected his decisions. I imagine the contrast between Cato and Caesar would have informed Washington's decisions around surrendering power. Aelius likewise was another example of not misusing power. There are a few on this list whose virtues include putting their fellow man above themselves. Elon putting humanity first, Fray Tormenta putting the children in his orphanage above him, Vitalis caring more about helping the ladies of the night than his own reputation. These are obviously at different scales, but I don't think it's about the scale of the action that makes it virtuous. I think it's doing the most you can with the power you possess. Then we have the men who displayed huge amounts of fortitude and willpower, which to be fair, most of the men on this list did to some degree, but here I speak of Churchill and King Baldwin. Churchill, who stood alone against the might of the Nazis, and Baldwin, who stood against the Caliphate despite his young age and illness. There are some really admirable men from this first 10. I look forward to finding more examples of virtue and sharing them with you. It's been a beneficial exercise for me to try and emulate the characteristics I admire in these great men. I hope you have found some use from it. If you have anyone you think deserves a Men of Virtue video dedicated to them, let me know in the comments. I will look into them. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed and want to see more from me.